Greetings all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. I'm excited to have Kathleen Dias on the show today. She is a writer and she is the spouse of a retired police officer, and she has opinions, and I love her opinions. And why not get a little groupthink? Why not jump on a call with somebody who thinks similarly to you, right? No need to challenge myself today. Today I get to have a great conversation with someone who is incredibly insightful, that has some serious knowledge bombs that I think a lot of people in America need to hear. So, Kathleen, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So some weird coincidences, you just never know how big or small the world is, but the Coptimizer podcast, our primary sponsor is Performance Protocol, and they are an executive coaching company, and they're bringing the concept of coaching to police departments. And I don't need to go into a whole lot about that, but when I reached out to you after I saw a letter that you had written, an article for Police1 magazine. I've been following you for a while. I've read a lot of your stuff in the past, but you wrote one in the days following the release of the video in Memphis. It was titled "A Letter to the American Public. Here's what real police reform looks like." Struck a chord with me. I know for a lot of police leaders and police officers around the country, they really appreciated to hear somebody screaming from the mountaintop besides us. And lo and behold, it turns out you're from Caldwell, Idaho, and Performance Protocol was just there not too long ago, hosting a leadership summit and discussing some of these very things that you're talking about: police recruitment, retention, development. How do we build the best police officers for the future? And you're in one of the epicenters.
Oh, I love to think of it that way. We've got a new police chief here. He's doing great things, and I'm thrilled that your people had something to do with it.
Well, it is a small world. So it's just a shout out to Chief Rex Ingram from Caldwell. I think by way of Los Angeles. So it's not just, everybody seems to be leaving California, right? Heading to Idaho. How are your property values doing out there?
They go up and down a little bit like every place, but they're still a lot higher than they were when we started looking to leave. We started looking at leaving California about the time my husband started thinking retirement might actually appear on the horizon someday. And we happen to live in a really remote part of California. And honestly, it wasn't even so much about politics or things like that as it was about I needed to move someplace with more resources. We were a place where it was easily 40 miles to even a medium-sized hospital or to a Walmart. And that was with 40 miles of 6% grades and switchbacks that was prone to close by snow and slides and mud and fire, even in the summer. And it's a tough place to live. The power grid got extremely unstable after the car and campfires. And I was like, you know what? I don't think this is where we want to make our final stand. So we started looking for places. And we settled on this area because the weather is fantastic. I mean, it gets cold, but it's dry and near a lot of resources. And we just love it here. Just love it.
So cold heat, right? Just like a dry heat.
Yeah, that's it. Actually, yeah. I mean, compared to where we were in the part of California that gets like all of the water for the rest of the state. So it could easily rain 60 inches between October and April. And the Treasure Valley gets, by comparison, about 12 inches of snow and about 12 inches of rain per year. So it's windy and it's cold, but it's just a lot easier to manage.
Well, it's beautiful. I can tell you that. I always enjoy my trips out west. And I understand what dry cold is. My last year in the service, which was a long time ago, I spent in a little Air Force remote base in Alaska, in a village called
Oh, yeah.
Galena. I've only met face to face one other person who's been there. Have met a couple people who've heard of it, but only one other person that's been there since I left. The base isn't there anymore, but yeah, it was a dry, dark, long, cold. That was
Yeah. Well, I'm an Air
that
Force
was Game of
brat.
Thrones stuff.
Yeah, I'm an Air Force brat. My dad didn't retire till I was in college, so I can testify that a lot of Air Force bases are not built in garden spots. They're built in places that are flat and windy.
Yeah. Well, it was fun for the first month I was there. Yeah, my ping pong games, I developed a pretty serious ping pong game in the year I was there. But I digress. So, for our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you wound up in Idaho via California?
Yeah. First of all, I know that this is probably unusual for some of your guests. I am a writer, and I'm a writer with a background in teaching and in marketing and recruiting. I am not law enforcement, never have been. My husband is retired law enforcement, and so I started in 2016 a social media account on Facebook called the Rural Badge. And I started that under a pen name, which I still use to write personal stuff in my blog, um, because I felt like there were a lot of stories, whether it was news stories or personal ones, of officers who do not live and work in metropolitan areas that were simply going untold. And this was an avenue where I could start to open that up. And I didn't know if anyone would find it or read any of it when I started, but they have. And eventually, one of the editors at Police1, Nancy Perry, came across one of my blog posts on a friend's social media page and chased me down and emailed me and asked if they could reprint it for Police1, see if it would go anywhere. So they did. And about that time, my husband was getting to retire. And I was able to say, sure, I would love to write a monthly column for you. And now I can write it under my own name because I don't need a firewall between his work and the stuff I do online. I still use the pen name for the social media pages and for my blog posts, but on Police1, I write as Kathleen Dias, like a grown up. And yeah, so my husband was a deputy sheriff and a police officer, and eventually retired as the district attorney investigator in a remote Northern California county. And that is where we spent our whole lives. And we were ready to kind of leave behind the severe weather and the remote transportation issues and the unstable power grid and a pervasive black market weed industry. And so
Yeah,
we
that's
moved to one.
crazy. I don't think a lot of people understand, what goes on in some of those national forests, particularly in California. The cartel grow operations that run out of there are
They
extensive.
can, and I'll plug a friend's writings here too. I've guested on his podcast with him and Wayne Saunders as well. There's a retired California Department of Fish and Wildlife lieutenant named John Norris who has written a couple of books. One is called Hidden War, and the other is called The War in the Woods, and that is exactly what it is about. One of the things people don't seem to get to, either where we lived was called the Emerald Triangle, which is Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties, the most productive marijuana growing region in this hemisphere, and huge cartel bases. It's a high intensity drug trafficking area despite its rural and remote nature. And honestly, some of the biggest organized crime there is not all Mexican and South American. A lot of it is East European. That's what we were seeing in the Ramos illegal area of it. East Europeans coming in and actually like buying up huge tracts of land, blading the tops of mountains off into the rivers, and then siphoning the rivers dry to grow their weed. A lot of human trafficking, a lot of labor trafficking. It's gnarly, and we were ready to be done.
What was the name of the book again for their listeners? I want to make sure everyone got that because
There are two of them. One is called Hidden War, and the other is The War in the Woods.
because I think he was on the Joe Rogan podcast.
He was very recently, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he's a very talented public speaker, and he's a really great advocate, and he moved to Montana as soon as he retired. And now he can speak his mind, and I've used him as a source in a lot of my articles. One that I just wrote actually about game wardens in California and New York being excluded from benefits other state law enforcement are entitled to, because as a retiree, he can say things out loud that the guys who are still working cannot. And that's actually why I write a lot of the stuff I write. A lot of the officers I talk with work for small departments. They don't have good workplace protections. They know I'll protect their identity and where they work, but I can look at the case and say, wow, that's not okay. It's not okay for you to be driving on, slick brakes and bare tires and
And
things like that.
and I'm glad you do, and I appreciate all your hard work on behalf of those that don't have a voice. And quite frankly, that's how you and I got connected. And I think that's why I'm excited to have this conversation, because the we're in another cycle where there's a lot of talk about reimagining the police, about police reform. And I just don't think the average American really has any idea what that even means. Ask somebody, hey, what does it mean to reimagine the police? Ask a politician when they say we need to reimagine the police. The first question out of your mouth should be, can you explain to me what some of your ideas for reimagining the police are? Because usually the first things I hear are, well, we need to change the way that we approach social services. We need to change the way that we approach mental health. We need to change the way that we approach addiction. And why do you think the police are involved in calls like that? How do you think we got here? And yeah, I guess I shouldn't be frustrated, because it's just kind of the reality of policing in America, in that we've dumped a lot of social issues onto the police, and then we are very quick to blame the police when interactions go sideways. And people that have been listening to the show hear me say this time and time again, so I apologize for the repetitive nature of this, but it's something I want to make sure everyone takes away. I call it the fundamental attribution error, right? We blame the police and bad outcomes from individual interactions on systematic failures, on systematic failures inside of the United States, in terms of how we resource our problems. Number one, how we create them, but then two, how we approach our, I guess our strategies, if you want to call it that, for solving them. So I'm all in favor of reimagining, and I think there's a ton that we can do better and do differently. But reimagining also generally for those same politicians comes in at the same time where the next thing they want to say is defund, or they want to divert funding to other social services, which is in essence defunding. So it's just a more polite way, what they think is a more palatable way of saying defund. And I'm off my soapbox now. Blood pressure.
It's a good soapbox.
Taking my tactical breath.
It's good.
Coming back down.
And I'm actually really grateful Police1 is willing to give me a platform, because with the exception of very, very few things over the past 3.5 years or so, they let me write pretty much anything I think needs to be said. And honestly, this reform piece is one that I wasn't certain was going to be a good fit for a commercial publication. So I ran it by my editor, and I offered to run it on the blog instead. And which is where another one of my pieces on Police1 that's actually still on one of their all-time most read list came from. It started as a blog piece, and they reprinted that. And they both have to do really with the public's expectations of police, and that a lot of the things that are asked, a lot of the things that are expected are simply not realistic. And I don't think they're unrealistic out of malintent. I think most of it is because people simply don't understand enough to even understand what they're objecting to. They see things that upset them and they don't know what they want fixed, but they know they don't want more of that. And so kind of this article was saying, if you want something completely different, you're going to have to do something completely different. And this was kind of my laundry list of what those different things are. And I think it's probably alien to most of the public because they tend to get their impressions of what police are like, what their training is like, what their job is like, what the expectations are realistic from TV and movies.
Yep.
And none of that's realistic. Some of it's really fun, but most of it's not realistic. And especially my column is called Policing the Remote and Rural. And I chose that target because according to one statistic that I've seen from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they do a census of police departments every so many years. And according to the last police census, 64% of the police officers, law enforcement officers in the United States are employed by 5% of the departments.
Yeah.
And that means the other 95% are doing the Oliver Twist thing in the background with their hands out saying, please, sir, I want some more, because they don't have what these big departments are taking for granted. And even the big departments that have a lot of stuff may or may not be doing what the public wants, but it may not be possible. Money isn't really the only problem. A lot of it is political will and willingness to do what it takes to make these changes.
And that is really at the core of everything that we're talking about.
It is.
And I mean, that's, I wish I could say that louder. I wish I could get people to really kind of take a moment to listen. And that's, we were kind of having a little conversation prior to going on the air, but when it was late 2015, when at my agency where I retired from, where we started a podcast as part of our community policing unit. And we did it specifically for this reason, is that we found that in the media at large, and really through no fault of their own, a lot of good intentions, a lot of hardworking people out there trying to tell a story, trying to do what needs to be done. Well, try to cram an investigation that's going to involve, dozens of officers, multiple days, sometimes weeks, months, years, into 30-second, 90-second, 2-minute sound bites. Yeah. You're just not, all you're getting is what they have time for, and then really what they think are the highlights. And then, of course, in the digital media world, what's gonna generate click-throughs and what's going to generate reads, and that's how people, that's what's driving revenue. So you can't really necessarily blame them for what they're doing, because that's kind of their job. But at the same time, it gets frustrating when you spend 20-30 minutes with a reporter explaining to them the nuances of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then you get a 15-second or a 10-second clip from everything that you've said. And it's one of the most irrelevant things, maybe. So, when it comes to, educating, getting trained on how to speak with the media, I mean, there are certain tips and strategies that anyone that's, PIOs, law enforcement leaders, or anyone that, and quite frankly, I think one of the things that we want to focus on today was really how this affects, the rural areas and rural police that, a lot of times they're not afforded the luxury of calling the PIO, right? Because
most small departments don't have one.
On a given day, you might be the sheriff, the PIO, the animal control officer, you name it.
I've actually written about one of those problems, another one of my P1 articles, and it came out of there was an incident up in Modoc County, California, I think in 2016, when a young deputy was shot and killed This one kind of resonated with me because I recognized his name, and it turned out that he had been a student at a school where I had been working as a substitute teacher when he was in high school. And the more you read about the incident, it was super rural, super remote. His sheriff was his immediate backup and actually was the instrumental in engaging the bad guy a second time and managing to apprehend him. And then everything just fell off the radar for about 48 hours, and it was driving everybody crazy, everybody local, everybody in their news region, which is geographically enormous, just sparsely populated, until CHP showed up doing news releases. And it turned out, well, the problem is it's a small department. The sheriff was actually involved in the shooting, and there was no one left to speak to the media.
Yeah.
And and that's a real issue that, if you're in Detroit or Chicago or something like that, that's just simply never going to be an issue. But it is in the places that I write about. And so I try to bring that into people's focus, that these people are the people you're talking about as well when you're talking about reform. It's not just about the guys you see in the big cities in the news. And if you're talking about big sweeping reforms that are going to take place at a state or a national level, you have to look at that other 95% of officers and say, how does that include or exclude them? And then what? That's my favorite question. Then what? You tell
Yeah.
me anything and I'll say, okay, then what? Let's think this through. Let's carry that on. And I don't think people are doing that very much.
Well, and it needs to be done. Um, look no further than Uvalde, right? And there was a 6-officer
Yeah.
police department, and they have an active shooter incident in a school, a national tragedy. And it's the expectations from the public for the response from Uvalde are no different than they are for Chicago, Detroit, NYPD. Doesn't matter, right? The public expectation is the same. And I think oftentimes in what you mentioned earlier is this idea of who the police are and how they're trained is often created by the media and mostly through pop culture, right? Through
Absolutely.
and
Well,
that's
and I'm sorry,
no
going
good.
back to Uvalde, the failures in that response weren't a factor of the size of the department, because there are several examples, and actually I cited them in yet another article, sorry,
Yep.
of individual officers, one of them very young from a very small department, who went in by himself as he was trained and as is expected, and put an end to an active killer. In that case, it was in a nursing home. And by the time Uvalde wrapped up, there were 400 officers on scene. So that stuff really isn't a factor of the size of the department. But that's how it ends up. In fact, it ended up in a Washington Post article that was critical of the department. Should these departments that are that small even exist? That's really a completely separate question from what kind of a flaming dumpster fire we had down there.
Yeah, and I always love it when people from DC or these large metropolitan areas make statements like that. What they've never lived in a rural area. They don't
Nope.
understand it. They don't know what
No.
it's like. What are you even saying? Do you even know what that? Do you even understand any of the ramifications of what that is? And I think
Exactly.
there's probably good intention, right? The intent in their mind is like, well, we want the most professional, highly trained, best equipped police officer that we can get to respond to these incidents, and it shouldn't matter where it is in America. We should be able to get that. So why is the immediate thought that a small police department can't provide that same type of service?
Well, and if they can't, it's a failure of resourcing. Usually, it's not the people. I had a really great interview a while ago with the sheriff of Doña Ana County in New Mexico, and she was talking about legislation. In that particular case in New Mexico, it happened to be about body cameras, and okay, everybody has to have them. That's really cool. But then if there isn't financial support that goes along with that, and the department that is small or rural or remote fails to comply, it looks as if they are unwilling to comply instead of unable to comply.
Right.
And it's going to play exactly that same way in the public eye. Those are two separate things. You may have a department of 5 people or 12 people or 30 people that may even have access to free training. Some of the training by different federal agencies is absolutely phenomenal and provided free to small and rural agencies, but the officers still have to get there. And when they're gone, they're not patrolling. And in a very small department, the reality may be there is no one to backfill that position. So can you really afford to lose an officer? Because some of these courses, we're not talking 24 hours, it may be 2 weeks. And those sorts of logistics are very unromantic and unphotogenic, and nobody wants to spend much time with them because it just starts getting ugly and complicated. And, most of the people that are going on about it are either making money as public speakers and activists, or they're running for office, and they don't want to spend that kind of time unraveling that knot.
Yeah. So when it comes to rural policing, I know this can be it can be a sore point for you, and you mentioned it in this ties right into this conversation. So if you've got somebody in DC or in New York or Los Angeles, whatever, and they've got they grow up in an environment where they're used to seeing the LAPD or the NYPD or if there's an incident, you can have 5, 10, 20 police officers. I got an interview coming up soon. It'll be released with Inspector Greg Sheehan, who's retired from NYPD. And we kind of got into this conversation, like, training and tactics, and, how is training for the largest police department, the largest metropolitan police department in America compared to, outside. And mostly that was about logistics and the challenge there is when you're talking at scale, you've got the complete reverse problem in a rural area.
Absolutely.
Right? Like where
absolutely,
like, hey, all right, hey, we're going to make a change in state law, and we're going to change, let's say in the case of New York and their policy, no more chokeholds, and that's going to start tomorrow. Oh yeah, okay, all right. So we have 35,000 uniformed officers that we're just going to run down to the training center and train tomorrow, or we'll get them in the training tonight. And so tomorrow you won't see this. So years and years of training and psychomotor skill development. It doesn't matter if you're in a department of 1 or a department of 1,000 or 10,000 or 20,000. The training, the resources, the equipment, everything needs to be the same, or it has to be proportionate, and it has to be realistic for the environment in which they're deploying and they're working. And so while we were sitting here, I brought something up real quick, because this is what I want people to think. If you don't live in a rural area, if you've never lived in a rural area, right? What are the duties of a police officer? Yeah. Protect life and property, enforcement of laws and regulations, patrol, respond to police calls for service, conduct investigations and follow-up, investigate traffic accidents and crashes, conduct interviews, prepare written reports and field notes, arrest and process criminals, testify in court, who knows, perform CPR, use judgment in use of force cases. The list goes on and on. Does it matter? Does that sound like an NYPD officer or a rural deputy sheriff out in the middle of Idaho or Wyoming or Montana?
And it's actually the same thing. The primary difference, there are differences of scale, there are differences of frequency. There's one of the things that I tell people all the time, all the same things that happen in cities happen any place, including campsites in national parks, because all you need for bad things to happen is people. But the difference, it's true.
Oh, I know. That's why I'm laughing.
I've actually got an article cooking on incidents that began in urban areas that resolved in rural ones. because bad guys think the same thing city cops do. There's no cops out there. I'm going to go out in the country. So they move their bad stuff out there because they think nobody is looking. And one of the things that I've seen, is California is an enormous state, and the very northern end of it is extremely rural and remote. It's ranch land and national forest and all this kind of stuff. It's the same it's the same state as Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego. So every now and then you'll get officers who will leave those areas and move north. And I have to say, like one of the small departments my husband worked for in far northern California, they would get somebody new hired from a big city, and it'd be like, oh, all right, yeah, we got it. And it wasn't because he was a city guy. Nobody really cared about that. Everybody comes from somewhere eventually. It was because a lot of the city guys expected specialists, and there aren't any. It's like, if you answer the call, you're going to be following that all the way through to court. You're going to be processing the scene. You're going to be lifting prints, taking pictures, taking measurements, doing accident reconstructions, all those things your own darn self, because there just isn't anybody else. There's no CSI here. There's no crime scene techs. You may only have one detective for the whole department. And they know he's not going to have those skills. I talked to a guy, that was retired LAPD. Sorry, picking on LAPD, but those are where the retirees came up to the part of the state where we lived, and seriously told us that he had never written a report longer than an FI card his whole career. Jeez. And kind of went, okay, that's an alien thought, because that just does not happen. And then you get the guys that really work out in the middle of nowhere, like game wardens and stuff like that. It's like they're not just doing the hunting and fishing things. It's like if they come across, a moose that's down in the middle of nowhere and they suspect that it has been poached, they're going to post that beast right there on the spot themselves with a necropsy kit they've got in their car. They're just going to be up to their elbows in that moose themselves, because you're not moving a 2,000-pound beast into the back of his pickup truck and then to some forensic lab somewhere that autopsies moose, really? But that doesn't make it onto the TV screen or in the movies and stuff like that. That's the thing, is there's no specialists out there. It's all you.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can make the argument, right, that if you're going to work in those areas, that you need more training, not less, because you can't.
Actually, yeah, I would. I would, because
and I agree wholeheartedly, because that's the benefit of having a large department, is that you can specialize. And there's always this push and this pull and this, the trying to right size your specialty units and your patrol division. Like, what's the most effective way to really provide the highest level of service that's going to drive the highest value for the time of the people that you have that are out there. So that means some agencies, if you live in an area where there's a lot of traffic crashes, like for one, if you have officers, if you don't have a traffic unit, then the officers that respond are going to do the investigation. If you don't have specialists that are trained in accident reconstruction, so let's just say it's a fatality or something, that serious bodily injury, or maybe some extenuating circumstances that would require a reconstruction. Well, you have to do that. And if you can't do that, well, the more you're going to get those resources, right? So now they're going to have to come from maybe the state police or someplace else. But I mean, just even, I'll just, use my own agency as just a quick example. Generally we investigate around 6,000, between 5,000 and 6,000 traffic accidents a year.
That's a lot.
Well, yeah. Well, it seems like a lot, right? But if I go, 45 minutes down the road to Indianapolis, then that's probably a month, right? If you go, if I drive an hour and a half north, to Chicago, that's probably a week. So everything's a matter of scale. But but you still have to have the people that have the skill set and the knowledge and the equipment to be able to do it, and do it in an efficient way. But we had
And if
we had a traffic unit, and I just to finish the thought, the traffic unit, if a patrol officer gets there, they can, if the traffic officer is available, we get the traffic officer there so the patrol guy can return back to his, and handling calls for service, and a specialist, in theory, if they're doing their job well, rather than a patrol officer taking 30 minutes to handle a crash, maybe the traffic guy can do it in 15 or 20 because he's very efficient at what he does. That becomes a force multiplier for you. But there's arguments to be made either way, against even doing that. Some would say, nope, every officer should be able to do start to finish right from the end. And I don't disagree with that, but I also think there are times where it's not as practical. But it runs into the exact scenarios that you brought up with someone coming from a metropolitan area to a rural area, like, hey, where's my CSI? Come on, bro. What's that? What
like,
do you mean?
do you have a mirror? Yeah. Well, and the other tool to use is relationship building and MOUs with other departments.
Yep.
Being able to piggyback off their training or use their specialists, that sort of thing. There's some stuff, coming from one state and then starting to talk to people from all the other states in the union, as well as Canada and Australia and the UK, finding out, some of the things that like I always thought were just TV gimmicks, like, jurisdiction ends at, the city limits or the county line or whatever. In California, every law enforcement officer who is sworn throughout the state. So, there's you let the county you're going into know as a courtesy what's going on and stuff, but it doesn't mean you can't arrest the person on the other side of that line. I always thought that's like a Dukes of Hazzard thing, and I've learned that in fact was misinformed, that actually does happen some places. That makes it even more important for the interaction and the cooperation between agencies. One of the things I've talked about that can be an obstacle to reform is that hyper-local focus of United States law enforcement. Here in Idaho, I think we have 44 counties, and it's quite a large state. Most Western states are. And then you move to someplace like Kentucky, there's, I think, 120 something sheriffs in Kentucky, which is less than half the size of the state, plus municipal police departments, plus state police, plus game wardens, plus you're dividing a pie up in a whole lot of little bitty pieces there, and nobody wants to give up any of their local control. They need to find ways to work very well together then at that point, I would think.
Well, control generally stems from resources, and that's the fear, right? Nobody wants to give up control because they're worried about losing resources, and they're worried about losing funding. And that's, again, it's another problem. Why? Yeah. So when we talk about defunding, nope, not even remotely the answer. The answer is more funding, so you don't have these these territory and turf wars, because I've said this all the time. There is plenty of work to go around. Plenty of work to go around. Nobody has to worry anytime soon about there not being enough work for the police to do.
Well, and the more officers, more funding thing, when I'm talking about small departments and stuff like that, more officers means that those officers can go to training. It means they can get enough sleep. It means that maybe they can fit in a workout before they go back to work. Those sorts of things. A lot of rural officers live in places where childcare is difficult to non-existent. And if they're working opposing shifts with a spouse, the more officers that you have, the more flexible they can be. And that is frankly a luxury in a lot of the places that I write about.
Absolutely. And that was one of the headings for the article that you wrote that struck home with me. Real reform means more officers, for all of those same reasons. And when we look at cases like the Garner case in New York, or the Chauvin case, where there's, or even like the Freddie Gray in Baltimore, you can kind of go up and down this list of, maybe it's tactics, maybe it's a lack of training, maybe it's a lack of emotional control, maybe it's a combination of all these things. And so, there's people that will say, every police officer should be highly trained in jujitsu or some form of martial art. But the general public thinks that's the case, right? They think that police officers are Chuck Norris is coming when you call, and that's just not the case. The reality is they're probably getting 40 to 80 hours of training throughout their 16 weeks in their academy. If they've got a good, robust field training officer program at their agency, they're going to get a lot more than that. But that's not, likely the case. And I think the example that we talked about when we chatted the first time, okay, great. We've got, we're in rural Northern California, and we've got the resources now to get our officers trained to become blue belts in jujitsu. Now, where do we send them?
Exactly.
So
you can't make that dojo, magically appear. And this is a perishable skill.
And it needs to be trained frequently. Not, we're talking a couple times a week, if you want to be good. And that's over years. That's not go to a 3-day course once a year. That's better than zero, but it's also, sending, and this is another model in policing that we have to use, because economically it's really the only way that we can get the training to work. It's not ideal. It's not even close to ideal, but it's the best that we can do with the resources that we have. Is okay, well, we're going to take one, the guy that, that likes to fight, or maybe he was a high school wrestler, maybe he wrestled in college, and we're going to send him to defensive tactics instructor school. And, we'll send him there for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. He'll come back and he can train the other officers. Is that a step up? Absolutely. You can get a lot of good training done that way, and you can develop a level of proficiency, but there's a cap there. And it's not, if someone on television is watching and they expect, Conor McGregor, they're going to be highly disappointed in what they see. And that's also the other end of what we're seeing in body cams in the last 5 years, the last 7 years. It used to be just the police seeing this and the people that were involved in this, but now, the opportunity that's here for America is that now we get to truly see the level of training that our police officers are trained to. And you get to decide as a country whether you think it's enough or not enough. And if you don't think it's enough, it's time to pony up, because it's going to cost. It's not free, and it takes time and it takes people. So I think we do a very good job with the limited resources that we have, with the budgets that we have to train and to do well. But there's a long way for us to go if we want to improve policing.
Well, the idea that if it is a profession, then you have to have professional standards and professional expectations and professional compensation. And that's not what we're seeing in most places. And the average police pay gets thrown around a lot. And people seem to forget how one comes to a mean when we're calculating it. And that means that you're coming in at the average of the very highest and the very lowest. And a lot of the places I write about fall on that very lowest end of the scale. And it's going to be very hard to get an officer, however much they want to be, And however hard they try to get above a certain level of professionalism, if they're not paid enough to live in a place that's safe for their families, if they have to make choices between practice ammo and diapers, if they're expected to pay for training or gym access or whatever on their own time, but the reality is that they're working 2 side gigs just to make ends meet. And I've had a lot of people get really grumpy with me when I say stuff like that. And all I can tell them is, you're not talking to the officers I'm talking to. And I'm talking to plenty of officers, especially the South, the Plains, the Midwest, that are making still less than $40,000 a year. And even some places, Kentucky's game wardens right now are in a huge bind, in a huge recruiting bind, and a huge retention bind, because Kentucky's done some ugly stuff with experimenting with their pensions, and their game wardens still make $35,000 to $38,000 a year, where their state troopers were just given an across the board $15,000 a year pay raise. Now they both look at it and go, we're all state law enforcement officers, sworn and trained. In fact, the game wardens go to an extra academy after they finished the regular one for another 12 or 14 weeks. I'm sorry, there isn't any place in the United States left anymore where that's a living wage.
No, and I think that, that's a great perspective, and I really want people to let that sink in for a minute, because when you're trying to recruit people of high character, high integrity, that have the base level, the requisite skills to be able to do the job, people that are going to be able to grow into the job and be true professionals. It just in my community alone, there's a technology boom going on. There's a manufacturing boom going on.
Yep.
You can go be a trades, work in the trades and make twice the salary that you're going to make as an entry level police officer.
I was interviewing a sheriff in one of the Plain states last fall for another article. And we were talking about a completely separate topic. He was talking about his hiring difficulties, and then happened to casually mention that he doesn't take his insulin because he can't afford it. He's the sheriff. If he can't afford it, what can his deputies not afford? And is it really fair then to say nobody wants to do this job? Nobody wants to work?
Yeah.
Well, maybe they'd rather work at Walmart or Target and get better medical coverage.
Yeah, I mean, and it's there's no shortage, I think, of people that would be willing to do the job, and I think that would be good at doing well. I can't say that, because we do know that there is just overall a workforce shortage coming, just from a population perspective. The number of young men and women of that are coming into the age group to work in policing, that population is declining. So
yep,
there is another. And I had this conversation with Matt Dolan on a previous episode, and I would encourage people to go listen to that, because we had a discussion about their firm. They published a paper called "Weathering the Storm in Police Staffing," and it really is telling about some of the things that we have to really be thinking about for the future of policing. So you throw things like what's happening in Memphis and Minneapolis on top of an already, dry forest. We'll use your West Coast analogy there with forest fires, right? I mean, the whole house could come burning down here soon if we don't start thinking about how we're going to turn this around. So
it does. There's a critical mass that will reach at some point.
Well, so last night, I know this episode is going to be played well after the Super Bowl, but came across an article in Philadelphia about, it's an all hands on deck approach. Why they're worried about a significant, what might happen if Philadelphia wins or loses, right? Because this is socially acceptable now, that you get to, take to the streets and burn, loot, and destroy things because a sports team either wins or loses. It's kind of, it's really silly when you say it that way, but that's the truth, right? And now you've got to have a lot of police out there. Well, what's the staffing for the Philadelphia police overall right now, right? they're having the same problem that every other major metropolitan area is having. So that when the public reads this story on the surface, like, oh man, what might happen if we win or lose? What's the mob going to do? Oh, but I feel better now because it's an all hands on deck approach. We're bringing in extra resources, which is the truth, right? But now what's the story that's not being talked about in that article is, well, what are you sacrificing to be able to do that? What calls for service are you not going to work for the next 3 or 4 days? Where are you pulling the people from? And then, by the way, for the people that are coming into work extra, how many days in a row are they going to work? How many hours per day are they going to work? They still have families. They still have responsibilities outside of work. But now we're going to put them in a potentially a higher stress environment. But they're going to be more individually stressed, potentially, right? If we don't staff this correctly, because they're going to be working longer hours. And, when you're working longer hours, you're sleeping less. When you're sleeping less, that affects your physiology. These are the things that when people see bad policing on video, it never even crosses their mind, right? They just think, oh, bad, fix, bad, do something. Somebody should do something about this. And
to me, there's a difference too between criminal behavior by law enforcement and something that could be averted with better training, more rest, those sorts of things. Overt criminal behavior to me is a choice. Somebody who loses his temper on a one-time thing, has a rant on his body cam, those sorts of things. I had somebody tell me in relation to a family thing, looking back, one of your best young officers suddenly goes to maybe you should try to find out why. So to me, that's also a leadership issue.
Absolutely.
You can't, you don't get your best results treating human beings as if they're disposable, no matter which side of the body camera they're on.
That's what we call a sign. There was a comedian, right? Here's your sign.
Yes. Jeff Foxworthy.
So
a lot of good rural humor there.
Oh my gosh. So when you see, and again, this may not, my theory may not hold true, as I'm going to reserve judgment to hear kind of what Memphis actually did in terms of how they circumvented their normal hiring process for their police department. But prior to this, what I generally was saying, and this is a warning that I started to give 7-8 years ago, was that we don't have the problem in policing that people think that we do. But in 10 years, we're going to have it because we're not going to get the people that we need. And I'm on the record, as far back as 2014 and talking about this. And so, I hate to say that I was right, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of figure it out. But if you cut corners in your hiring process, you're not fixing anything. You're breaking things. It's just not a matter of when it's, if it's going to happen. It's when and how bad is it going to be. Yeah. But outside of that, prior to the last few years, the saying I had is in policing, we don't hire bad people. We hire good people and we break them. And we break them because we overtask, we undertrain, we under-resource. And that's not it's not a solution that's sustainable. 20 years ago, guess what? Next man up, next woman up, come on in, throw on the uniform, let's go. Police officers are dying 18 to 24 years below the national average. Cardiovascular disease rates like 18 to 24 times higher than the general population. All kinds of things that are happening because of the physiological demands that we're putting on our police officers. it takes a long-term toll on the body. And so there's a reason why, and you mentioned the pension issue in Kentucky. There's a reason why pensions were established, and there's a reason why we want police officers to retire after 20, 25 years. You don't want a patrolman that's been on a job for 35 years to have to engage in a foot chase or get into a physical altercation with a 6'4", 300-pound 18-year-old. That's not going to be a good outcome. It's going to escalate force.
That's another expectation people have that comes out of TV, is the idea that there are a lot of light duty positions, desk jobs, those sorts of things that you kind of like end up in. I know in small departments, they never existed to begin with. And that has been a problem because it doesn't just create a dead end for promotional opportunities, but also there's only so many places you can go when your body starts to betray you. But I think we're starting to see that in cities as well now, as so many specialist jobs become civilianized. I was referring a friend of mine that I have a lot of political discussions with because we can do it politely. And so that's kind of fun to have somebody you can talk to that way who thinks a little differently than you do.
Yep,
But I was
absolutely.
referring her back to a classic film called Fort Apache, The Bronx.
Oh
Remember
yeah,
that one?
Charles Bronson. Heck
Okay.
yeah.
It was Paul Newman.
Oh yeah, that was Paul. What was
And
that was well, no, was Chuck Bronson in that? All right, now I got to
I
look it
don't
up.
know. He may have been. But Paul Newman's character was the main one, but he was the salty older guy that was kind of there watching his world burn down around him. And the fascinating thing is it's like holding up a mirror from the early 70s to hear, all of the same protests, all of the same slogans, all of the same street stuff going on. But one of the themes that was running through it was he was the older guy showing one of the younger guys how it really works out here. And okay, well, that guy's one of our regulars and he's not stable, but we can handle him this way. We don't have to go hands on with him. I know him. Let me show you. Those guys aren't working any longer. They leave. And some of them because they're just done, and some of them because you can't physically do it forever and there isn't any place else for them to go.
It was Ed Asner, Paul Newman.
It's a classic indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, my apologies to all the Fort Apache fans out there, because I probably just made a few people flip
But
over in their
that's,
graves.
one of the things that actually, I'm kind of a history buff. I'm definitely a news hound. And it drives me crazy when I hear people acting like all of this stuff is new, because it's not. It's just that the last time it happened was probably in the late 60s and early 70s. And, then coming out of New York, you had the Christopher Commission and all of those sorts of things. And everybody started over and reset, and we're going to change and everything is different. But it's not just the police that have to change, as the community's expectations, the way they interact with things. I tell people, communities express their priorities with their budgets. And unfortunately, in a lot of the most conservative places, we see the most pushback to that's actually where I get officers getting in touch with me and saying, do you know anybody who's got used vests they can donate? We can't get tires on our car. Those sorts of things that the city guys just absolutely take for granted. I'll see pictures from a news article after an officer involved shooting, and there's some guy who's like, 6'5" standing there, and he's wearing plate carriers, but that's all he's wearing is plate carrier, and it barely covers his 5X. He doesn't have a vest. His department doesn't issue them. You can't expect somebody who's making $15 an hour to buy their own. Sorry.
No, they're expensive. They've gotten a lot better, but I was just at TaserCon, and that's a training conference that was in Las Vegas. It was hosted by Axon, and they had Kathleen, oh my gosh, She was a pioneering woman in policing early, ultimately became a chief, and she's doing a lot of great work now, and her name's going to come to me. Which, by the way, I was also going to say, so just this morning I took this, and this is I'm not a paid sponsor for a thesis, but maybe someday I will be. So they have supplementation formulas on nootropics and other things in terms of for your memory, and it kind of customizes to you as an individual.
Yay.
So I'm one of these.
What's this stuff called?
I know I'm a biohack guy. So when I made that the Paul Newman Chuck Bronson era there, I was just like, see, there's another good example of where my aging brain is grabbing the wrong information at times, or not grabbing the information I need in the moment.
It happens. There's too much going on in there. It's too much to sort from.
Well, anyway, the point about the vest is, she told the story about the, female officers when their department got a vest, they weren't fit. There was no cuts for women. So it was
it matters.
Yeah. And I've never, it seems, it's just like, well, it's not that long ago either, right? I mean, these things are, we're talking 10, 15, 20 years, that we've made these huge strides, but yet, in conversations like this, you realize, man, we have so far to go, because right.
We do.
And now, I know you're touching on this because that's what you're talking about, right? Real reform means adequate equipment. That's exactly what you said. It means like we've got to have vests, but not just vests, but vests that actually fit. Not hand-me-downs, not a male vest with 2 holes cut in the chest, so it'll fit on a woman. And that's exactly what they did for this woman. I was just like, oh my God.
Well, and just
well, that's going to help.
Ergonomics being a thing now. It's not even just about accommodating the way breasts are shaped. Women bend at a different place than men do. The space between the bottom of the rib cage and the top of the hips is different. It's an entirely different cut. And, people make all kinds of cute jokes about it, especially because the military is usually on the pioneering end of that sort of a study, taking measurements and seeing how the averages work out, and how can we do that. And that's one of the things about the human body, is when guys come in different sizes, but all more or less in the same way, and women come in different sizes in like 100 different ways. And if the vest doesn't fit, it's not going to work. You're going to have gaps, and everybody already, dreads the triangle of death and the armpit shot anyway. But why give them that many more openings?
It just, I mean, seriously, like the person that did that, I wish we could go back and find the person who actually did that and thought that was a good idea.
Thank you. That was exactly what I was going to say. Like, thought that was a good idea.
So it's all right. If, what happens if she gets shot in the boob, right? Like, how's this vest gonna help?
Can help, yes, because that's kind of primary targets right there. That's right in that area.
Center mass. So, I mean, that's
and it is, and those are the sorts of things. I know quite a few small departments that have. Well, okay, let me back up. I know a few chiefs and sheriffs that I'm personally in touch with that have done a truly stellar job of obtaining grants every 5 years on the cycle to make sure all their people get upgraded vests on the calendar. Everything fits, all that sort of thing. The federal grants that are available for that, the only string that's attached is you have to write a policy that says your people will wear the vest, and then you have to make them wear them.
Yeah.
But then I also know.
Yeah, we use that program.
Exactly. And it's available. It's, grants are a headache, but it's out there. I also have actually been directly told by a couple of police chiefs and sheriffs that they won't use it because they don't want to be beholden to the feds. I have an issue with that, but that's probably a whole other podcast, especially when you're talking about your officer safety. And then I have some others that just have kind of done an in between where they end up with like a checkout pool. And they come in and they check out a vest like they would have checked out a portable radio in 1992. but the vest isn't made for them. And it may or may not fit them properly. And whether it's too big or too small, it's going to have its own issues. And that's a thing that only gets fixed with budgets.
Yeah, and you mentioned a second ago that the military, in terms of the research, they're ahead of the curve, and this is something I brought up pretty frequently already and early in my podcasting career. Is like, yes, when you have police departments don't have research and development budgets. It's
They
just
do
not
not.
there. So I'm fortunate to be right in the backyard of Purdue University, which is one of the preeminent engineering institutions in the world, quite frankly.
That's awesome.
And
what a resource.
And it was great. But well, if but you got to partner with them in the academic world, right? They're fighting for the same thing that everybody else is, right? They're fighting for funding and money to be able to do the research. But DHS had a program called a vaccine that was where they were partnering STEM research universities with practitioners and academics, saying, "Hey, let's come up with some ideas and develop some products, software solutions, whatever it might be to improve public safety and also Department of Defense." So it was cool. It was cool opportunity, but outside of that, when it comes to things like using data and big data and just all of the body camera technology, that's been, I think when in 20 years from now, when we look back at how this is, the body cameras themselves, what people don't realize are the main catalyst for this change that we're seeing. The dash cams helped a little bit. Individuals being able to walk around with cell phones and film things has helped a little bit, but the body cams themselves are now giving every person in America, in the world, a front row seat to what it's like, now to see it, but, and the caveat that I try to tell people all the time is like, well, you're seeing it, but you're not feeling it. You're not experiencing it the same way that a police officer does. You can watch from the luxury of your couch, wherever you are. You're not staring down the wrong end of the barrel of a gun. You're not in a house that's on fire. You're not in a car that's traveling at speeds that can kill you. These things, it's a lot different. It's a very sterile, and that's kind of problematic. But in the end, what this is doing is it's showing everybody what our real limitations are, and what the limitations of people are. So again, I don't want to get too far off track, but vests are just one part of it, right? And now, all right, now I am going to go on another little tangent, because we get in this argument about the militarization of the police and about why this is bad. And I'm like, all right, let's rewind the clock, people. Let's go back. Let's go back to the mid 90s, when we started to have, you can go back even a little bit further, right? If you're New York City, or if you're in
back
London
to the 1930s, and you can find armored vehicles and Tommy guns.
Yeah. Well, actually, we've got the Dillinger gang.
Yep.
Used to operate in this area. We actually, so in our property room, we're building a new police department, and when it's done, one of the things that we're hoping to be able to put on display is a Tommy gun, a Thompson, nickel plated. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. But yeah, I mean, point being is that you have to have the right equipment to be able to handle any task that you're responsible for. And if people look at police officers today and they think, oh my gosh, they look so militaristic. Well, why? Why do they look that way? Look what a police officer is carrying today. They're carrying a firearm. They're carrying a radio. They're carrying a taser. They're carrying handcuffs, usually at least 2 pairs of handcuffs, sometimes more. They're carrying spare magazines. They're carrying a magazine for their rifle, which is in their car. They're carrying an IFAK. They're carrying a body camera. There, if you've got a 30 or a 32-inch waist, guess what?
You got to put it somewhere.
It's not you're not wearing it on your belt. So what does that mean? Well, you got to have it in your car. Okay, well, yeah, but you can still have that nice shiny uniform on, because that's my expectation for you, is that I want you to look the way that I think you should look. But at the same time, I also want you to be functional. I want you to be able to respond and handle the things that I also want you to handle. Oh, well, all that stuff won't fit on me, so I'm going to have to wear a load-bearing vest. Well, no, that looks militaristic. Don't do that. Okay, well, then I'm going to have to leave it in my car, or I'm going to leave it somewhere else. So that means somebody might bleed out because I'm not going to have my med kit on me, or I might have to shoot somebody instead of tasing them because I can't carry a taser with all this other stuff. And these are the little nuances that our community members need to be educated on, and they need to understand why. Why does a police officer carry all these things that they're carrying? And oh, by the way, and if they're not, what's the risk that we're asking them to undertake? And then what's the risk to the community when I can't send an officer, when I have to send an officer with a handgun up against somebody with an automatic rifle? Let's go back to West Hollywood shootout, in California.
Well, and there are rural versions of those as well. And all of those things cost money. You referred to an IFAC, TACMED training, all those things. Then we're back to, if you're not in a department with a deep enough bench that you can rotate officers in and out for training, how do they get it? Do you bring a trainer to them? And even if you do, that costs money. There are things that are free, like Stop the Bleed, but a more advanced class, there's actually some that are taught by federal agencies that will come to you and do it for free, but it's time consuming. They're anywhere from 1 to 3 days. You still got to be able to get your guys there, rotate them through that. I have had there's a guy I've talked to a lot out of one of the Plains states. He is a TACMED trainer, contacted me very, very frustrated a few years ago because a department he had contacted and offered TACMED training to told him flat out it costs too much. I think he was charging $100 for the whole course. And also told him tourniquets cost too much. I'm not sure what the going rate for a tourniquet is at the moment, but we'll say, I don't know, $20 to $40. Is that about right? And
they can be more. I mean, again, it's just, what do you want to be? What's the service you want to be able to provide? I can tell you this: we've saved more people with our officer med kits than we've saved officers. And I'm going to knock on wood, right? That's the way. Hopefully we can keep it that way. But
and this is what precipitated this guy reaching out to me, because he's somebody I talked with casualty at that point, but this one was the full on, I need a place to dump. One of that department's young officers had just started off in a foot pursuit, got shot in the leg. Nobody had TACMED training. Nobody had a tourniquet, and he died.
Nicked his got his carotid or his femoral artery.
Femoral artery. Yep. And now there's, probably a road sign or a bridge or an overpass or something named for him because he's a hero. But I would really rather you had a bake sale and gotten the kid some TACMED training and taught him to use that tourniquet, have one on him, or he had backup. Which doesn't always happen in rural areas. This numbers I've been tracking for 5 years now show that the fatality rate for officers shot in rural areas far exceeds what it should. And I think we can bring that down if they have backup and if they have what they need. But if they have backup, but they don't have the education that they need, they don't have the training that they need, they don't have the tools, because what? Your department saved $140 on that one officer? You gonna tell his mom that when you hand her that flag?
Yeah, it's infuriating when you think about it, right? And and again, for just as a reminder, for rural and urban, this is more critical for your small rural urban department or than your urban departments, because
It is.
they are out there by themselves. They don't, there's
They
not
are.
an ambulance that's going to, or a fire truck that's going to be here in 3 to 7 minutes. Like that, we have the
Oh,
luxury of.
no, nobody will be there in 3 to 7 minutes.
No, you're lucky if you get somebody in an hour, right? I mean,
Yep.
that's the
Easily.
reality. So you've got to be able to, it's, I nobody's coming there. That's the way that you need to prepare and train for yourself. And sadly, we do
Absolutely.
know that the resources aren't there, and it's not in. You can put this on administrations because sometimes there are ways to get things done, and I don't know, for whatever reason they just don't. But um, there's also everything an administrator is doing is a choice. Whatever when your budget is limited and your resources are stretched and the demands on you are high, it's what, when I say yes to something, I'm saying no to a couple other
You
things. And
are.
if that one yes is expensive, guess what? There's 10 no's, and all of it is important, right? And as Stu Middleton, like to tell us, whole, operational tactics CEO, right? It's not a problem until it's a problem, right? And then it's a problem. Uh, and there's a lot of things that we face like that. And we're learning a lot and we're getting better. But to have a bake sale to try to raise money for life-saving equipment is, that's not the best way to approach these problems. It's not the ideal way. So yeah, I mean, there's a responsibility on administrators to make sure that they're doing these things. But just as an example for the med kits, one of the first, when we issued these, I want to say it was maybe 2013, 2012, 2013. The years are blending. But one of the first life-saving awards I issued post giving our officers carrying the med kits was for a teenage girl who was asleep in her apartment. Neighbors got in a shooting, a bullet comes through the wall, hits her right in the femoral artery, and
Jeez.
officer saved her life by because he was
Wow.
able to get there, stuff the wound, apply a tourniquet, and the ER doc told him right away, she would have died had you not
Yeah.
had that and done what you did. So
Yep.
and yeah, this could get me on a whole nother tangent. And it's like that's and it's the tough position that we put police leaders in when we're asking,
It
because we're
is.
going to hold you your community is going to hold you responsible, and they don't want to hear excuses. But at the same time, you've got to, this is why you have to have good relationships. I was very fortunate to to have a mayor that's a former police officer. So, it's, I didn't have to fight nearly as hard as a lot of other people do. So, all right, next item on the list, we talk, because that'll really get me going. And you talk about OSHA. The other thing, one of the things in my wellness world, and in the work that I've done in that arena, I chaired our wellness committee for our state chiefs association for years, but Indiana is not a presumptive benefit state. The last time I looked, 37 states were presumptive benefit states, but 13 are not. That number may have changed because it's been a couple of years since I've looked at that. But so for people that are listening and they're curious, what is a presumptive benefit state? Well, that means, like, if they're, for example, cardiovascular disease, which is running rampant in the policing world. If you're in a presumptive benefit state, then if you have a heart attack, whether you're on duty or off duty, it's considered a workman's comp issue. So it's, if you've been working the night shift for 7 years and you wind up having a heart attack, if you're in a presumptive benefit state, then your medical costs are going to be covered under workman's comp. It's not coming out of your own pocket just because you worked a 12-hour shift and now you're home and you have a heart attack while you're sleeping. So yeah, there's a whole, that's a whole episode on its own, just talking about some of the numbers around wellness. But I just wanted to bring that up because I know in rural areas now, you're talking a salary of $30,000 and limited health care and health benefits, what happens when an officer gets injured on duty?
A lot of times they get fired.
Yeah, that's despicable.
It is despicable, but they will usually, if they're not a state that has, I don't know what they call it in other states. In California, it's 4850 time disability, time that is specifically time off for medical rehab or recovery or whatever. Most municipalities, most counties have a very specific set amount of time that an employee's benefits and employment can continue in, if they're not back to work by full time by the end of that. Usually their code is that that person is terminated and the position is vacated to be filled again. And law enforcement officers are not exempt from that. One of the places when I talk about the ideas of like federal OSHA specifically exempts law enforcement from any workplace safety regulations. Some states have their own OSHA that is more stringent than the federal one and includes law enforcement. Most of them do not. And the places that do, one of the things that it does for administrators like you were, like my husband was it gives them a tool to be able to go to the people that actually control the budget and say, according to state government and labor code, you must provide safety equipment. You must provide these tools. You have to. And they can use that as a lever. In the states that don't have that, there's nothing. They're just adrift. Firefighters have national standards for safety and staffing. Law enforcement does not. And honestly, law enforcement as a whole isn't nearly as good at the PR game as firefighters are.
No, we're not. Hate to admit it, but it's damn true.
Yeah. That's something that came up in when I was talking with somebody for another article, and they're actually from the EMS and fire side, and they just said, you know what, firefighters will just look a news reporter in the face and say, if this does not happen, if we do not have these things, people will die. The end. And law enforcement for some reason is willing to keep banging their heads on that and doing more with less. And the fact is that there's a certain point beyond which it's just not possible. It's just not possible.
Real reform means being realistic about what cops can and can't change. And this this is the last paragraph, and this is, we've been going for a while, and I better start finding it out, otherwise my blood pressure is going to stay high, and
oh no.
And no, I don't have high blood pressure. I'm just saying these conversations really get me fired up. So real reform you wrote about this. Real reform looks like, changing laws that don't work instead of penalizing officers who enforce them. And how often do we see that?
You see that a lot of times, and actually the situation that I linked to in that sentence, probably everybody remembers seeing cell phone footage of a school resource officer wrestling with a teenage girl in a classroom in South Carolina, the desk overturning, and okay, it was all ugly. Okay, and I've got some perspective on both sides of this. I'm from a law enforcement family, but I also spent almost 30 years in high school classrooms as a career substitute teacher. So I didn't just see 100 kids a day. I saw 100 different kids a day. And I'm looking at it and going, okay, in the first place, the desk turning over didn't look nearly as terrible to me as it did to a lot of people, because I've seen about 1 million high school students tip their own desks over because they're very poorly designed and lightly balanced. And if you lean the wrong way, you can go over in them. I almost have. But that's not really the point. The point was that was over a student's refusal to A, participate in the classroom, and B, to give up her cell phone to the teacher. In South Carolina, disturbing a classroom is a misdemeanor. So once that officer is in there and it has happened in his presence, it's no longer a discipline issue at that point. It is a criminal justice issue. No school I've ever worked in has that law. A student who won't give up her cell phone to me, I would either have just sent the student and her cell phone to the office, or I'd have decided not to pick that battle, ignored the student, written her up later, and let the principal deal with it rather than turn it into something where now every student in the room is looking at me and that student. But in that state, the law said, the teacher says, the student refuses. She then calls the SRO. He says the student refuses. Now it's a legal issue. Nobody any longer has a choice. Does the officer have a choice to walk away at that point?
Well,
Possibly, but
yeah,
yes and no.
you can use
Then what's he
discretion in a
going to do?
misdemeanor, but yeah, we call that
But then, but
long
this is a
forming it.
classroom situation. What does the teacher do then? Now she can't teach. Nobody else can learn. This has escalated in a way that was completely unnecessary because of the way the law was written. And I would say then remove that law, make that back into a school disciplinary issue, figure out another way to do it. But that was a lot of people in a terrible situation that worked out well for none of them.
Oh yeah, it's a great example. I used it all the time. I showed that in my Citizens Academy courses, or Community Citizens Academy, and I just show it, and I just use it in other discussions. What do you want? What do you want the officer to do?
Exactly.
So the first question is but in the end, right? Who gets all the brunt of all the criticism?
The officer did.
Right. And now, in certain respects, he earned a lot of that, right? By the way that he responded. He did not react well. But my question overall is, why is the officer even in there in the first place, right?
Thank you.
And so now we could blame the teacher. We could say, well, why is the teacher, why are we calling an SRO? Why doesn't the teacher handle that? Or why doesn't the teacher call the principal or who the school disciplinary is? And a lot of people sadly then don't go back to, well, what is the behavior that's driving the problem?
Yes.
And okay, we have a student that feels empowered. Now, there may be some things going on. I don't know the situation with that individual student, if there's some, emotional control issues or whatever, but
there's almost always something with any teenager,
right?
Even the ones that aren't troubled. So,
but how do you run a school? How can a teacher expect to have a classroom where that kind of behavior is occurring, whether it's tolerated or not? If it's occurring, what's the environment like?
Well, learning is not going on.
It's certainly
and that's one of the
not in
things
an ideal
I've
way.
told students before. I'm not going to argue with you about that, not because it's not worth discussing, but because that's not what this classroom time is for. And as long as you and I are going back and forth with that, we've got 29 other people in here listening to this instead of the lesson.
So there was a story on the news last night about a very tragic and sad story. A teenage girl who committed suicide 2 days after getting physically assaulted and beat up in school. And then the verbal bullying continued post incident,
and probably online.
And it had been going on long before that. But I think this, if people wonder why parents are really concerned about what's going on in their schools, they wonder why parents are showing up in droves at school board meetings, running for school boards. This is why. The old saying, right? The inmates are running the asylum, and right now, there's where does everybody wants someone else to be accountable and responsible, and it's never going to work. America can't exist in that environment. No amount of police can police your way out of a problem where people won't police themselves. Yeah. If you don't have societal norms that everyone's going to agree upon, or a base level, then then public schools aren't going to work. They won't. And people are figuring that out. And this is why now, after 20 years of declines and some of the best policing outcomes that we've seen, we've done a sharp U-turn in the last couple of years. Shootings are through the roof. Violent crime is spiking. I'm hoping that it's not gonna that it's not here to stay. And I do think that there are probably some trends that we can that we can anticipate. But this is the question I ask all the time. If you're not willing to invest in public safety, then to continue to try to keep peace and order, then you have to be then okay with the privatization of these services. And then also, quite frankly, we're going to revert back to New York City in the 20s and 30s. You're going to have gangs are going to run territories. People are going to be responsible. They're not coming to government. They're not coming to the police. The things are going to get handled in their own way.
I tend to be a little more optimistic than that, not because I have faith in human nature, but because I do understand the arc of history and things do go back and forth. That the wise men write 3,000 years again. What has been before will be again. What's been done will be done again. Means there's nothing new under the sun. So
I know. And I'm not trying to be doomsday. I just think I can kind of see the cycle coming. And
it is, and eventually people will have enough of it and pull out, and hopefully there'll be something left worth salvaging at that point. But right now, from the law enforcement perspective, a lot of people don't want the professionalism that they say they want. They want to outsource their dirty work on the cheap, and they're getting what they're paying for.
So and if people think that I'm exaggerating, then you better think again, because there's already been stories that have been written about it. And here's there's that area, it's outside of St. Louis, where there's a private security contracting company that's hiring off-duty officers that are coming out, and they're in the most affluent neighborhoods. It's not the poor, the underprivileged. The people that need the police the most are the ones that are getting it the least, because of some of these I think preventable scenarios that we're creating. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And if you're going to ask, and that's the funny thing is, and in the interview, I can't remember the officer's name when they were interviewing him. It's like, well, let me ask you this: like, why, if I'm working we'll go back to the salary and the benefits, like, you're going to tell me that I have to come to work on my days off, and you're going to pay me, really, quite frankly, a third of what I can make in my own time outside Absolutely. Of this. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like that, and not face anywhere near the risk. Well, how can you make me do that, and why would I want to do that? And
exactly.
And that's community in California recently, sent out. There was and it was a role. Maybe you're familiar with it. Maybe you wrote about this, where the sheriff had made notice that because of a manning shortage, that they would not have. They wouldn't have deputies out during the day.
That's Tehama County, yeah, and it was just south and east of where I used to live. And yeah, I did write about it on social media, not for Police1, but their DSA is pretty vocal, and so yeah, I picked up that cry because they have been hemorrhaging officers to Shasta County and to Reading Police Department and places like that, because their pay is terrible. They're exhausted. It's a high crime area. It is rural, and a lot of it is remote, but it's also an area with I-5 running right through the middle of it, and a couple of state highways that bisect it the other way. And so there's a ton of drug traffic. There's a ton of gangs. And then there's also, like a ton of cows and dust. And they're being expected to do everything with nothing. So yeah, that sheriff actually closed at least one level of his jail, and just said we're not going to have deputies patrolling on these particular hours. They cut back their dispatch hours and farmed that out to one of the regional dispatch centers, and just said that's this is what we've got. This is all we can do. And This is one of the fallacies I run into all the time, and it's one of the things I kind of hammer on that tends to make people a little cranky. Um, is this is California, and there's a perception that all of California is, super lefty, super blue, all that kind of stuff. This is right smack in the middle of North Central California. That is ranch land. And if you look at their voting record, this place is deep red.
Yep.
I mean, some of their county supervisors almost to the radical level. I'm really familiar with that area. That's the part of California where we lived for a long, long time. And you would think the idea of prying some extra budget money in that place was sacrilege, the way it's treated. And as I told you before, when we had a chat earlier in the week, everybody loves a free market until the commodities vote with their feet. And that's what these guys are doing. Somebody's respecting their time and their experience and their education and honoring the value that their lives and their health and their family relationships have. And they're moving to those departments. And I can't blame them. In fact, I encourage them every opportunity that I get. Because as long as officers keep saying yes to work to departments that treat them that way, nothing will change. It's got to hurt.
Well, I think that's probably a great place to wrap it up, because that's one of the things when we've been bringing the performance protocol model, and we've been doing pilots and then some rollouts, and then looking at the pre-survey data and the post-survey data, the the feedback that we're getting is staggering, right? And the younger generation, when it comes to recruitment and retention, for as much as people want to malign them, I give them a ton of credit, right? Because there are a lot of really smart, hardworking young people that, quite frankly, a lot of them were, especially our military veterans that have been at war. Like my generation, we weren't at war. We had the Gulf War and a couple, things, but we're in between.
We were right in the middle. Yeah.
And so, the things that we've asked our next generation to do, I mean, not only we didn't have to ask, they just stepped up and they did what needed to be done. And now in this working environment, they also recognize that, okay, I'm willing to do this, but I need to be treated appropriately and fairly. And if you don't, so, there's just it's a good time to be a cop, so I don't want to always be pessimistic, because quite frankly, there's never been a better time, because the pay is going to be there if you're going to the right places. And for those that are not willing to do it and not invest, you're going to suffer the consequences. And that's where I think that's where the investment discussion, you better take it seriously, and you better start investing in all these things that we just went through. Yep. Those are all the things that officers are looking for. They want to make sure that they're being valued. They want to make sure that their training is going to be good. They want to make sure that they're getting the best equipment, that they're not coming to work and driving cars with tires that are bald, or, a fifth generation car, or in some cases in rural areas, sadly, where a police car has been bought and sold 3 times, and it's still being used.
Yep.
It's just it's just not going to fly anymore. And we're in the process of sorting it out now. It's probably going to take us, I think, probably 10 years to really get it sorted out. But it's sorting itself out right now, whether people want to believe it or not.
Change is hard.
Yep.
Change is hard, and some of it cannot be avoided. There's a real tendency to look at the word reform and knee-jerk it as negative, but there are some things out there that need to be changed, and that was one of the things I was writing about in that article. There's some things that we've simply accepted as that's the way we've always done it, and that's always the worst reason ever to do something.
Yep. And I don't, and again, I do get a little doom and gloom sometimes, but I'm also a very optimistic person, and I don't like to end on negativity. I like to end on positivity, and I think the good things that can come from this are people like you are sounding the alarm. They're raising awareness. They're using the platforms that they have to bring attention to some of these concerns. I think as a country, we do find a way. We always do find a way, and I'm optimistic that we're getting to the point where we're close to realizing, yep, policing is as good as it's ever been, but guess what? It can be a lot better. It can be a lot better. There's a lot of things that we can do. We can continue to get better. Things like Memphis shouldn't happen. They shouldn't. But I'd like to say that's going to be the last, but it's probably not. I think. But the good news is those incidents are very few and far between. They capture all of the attention, but they're very, in the aggregate, when you're looking at data across 30 to 40 million police contacts across America, those things are they're the exception, the very rare exception. It doesn't happen very often, and that's what we also got to get past. We got to speak truth to what the issues are, and that's on all sides of the equation here.
And a lot of the changes that are on the way, ones I was writing about, those are things that are improvements for the officers. It's not just about everyone but them.
Right.
The more you improve their working conditions, the better an opportunity they're given, the better things are all around.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathleen. I really appreciate you spending some of your valuable time. So you've mentioned it a few times. You write for Police1. What's your website if people want to come directly to your
my
work?
blog.
Yep.
My blog is The Rural Badge, at theruralbadge.com. There's also a Facebook page and an Instagram account by the same name. And try to keep that one current with a lot of stuff that's going on that's pertinent to my audience, and discussions. Take a lot of questions from the inbox and put them out to the hive mind. And it's a lot of fun. It's a community.
Anything else you want to share before we shut her down?
No, sir. I think we've covered it.
Well, thanks for putting up with me for a couple hours.
Oh, it's been a privilege. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. And until the next time, everybody, I'm 1042. Log into www.performance-protocol and learn more about how to bring this program to your agency and community.